In the summer of 2023, after 5 years of nomadic living, and many more years of travel and living abroad before that, I convinced my husband, Del, that it was time for a base of our own in our home country of Scotland. 2 years later, our dream of a tiny house in the Scottish Highlands just became a reality. But let's rewind and tell you this story from the start. I'm Kim and this is Del.
Hello.
We met in a pub in Glasgow in 2007 when I was 22 and he was 28. I had a passion for travel, one that soon rubbed off on Del, and we spent the next decade exploring the world, working day jobs to pay for it. In 2018, we flipped that notion on its head and turned travel into our day jobs, eking out a living from our blog, YouTube channel, and photography and video creation. We've spent years prioritising the things that we love, like hiking, camping, saying yes to new adventures, and slowing down to experience life in new places. Over time, living out of our backpacks with minimal possessions and no permanent home has caused a shift in both of our mindsets towards simplicity, towards intentional belongings, uncluttered spaces, and environments that make us feel good. We've come to appreciate living out of small spaces, as long as they're well designed, which is no doubt why the idea immediately resonated when I first heard of a tiny house. But as nomads, we didn't need a tiny house. We had our tent and an ever-changing lineup of camper vans, hostels, Airbnbs, tall ships, and generous friends and family who would host us for a few days up to a few months. Then my mum was diagnosed with PLS, motor neuron disease. And just like that, for the first time since I was a teenager, the desire to travel long-term, far from home, vanished. In the immediate sense, I wanted to be around, to stick closer to home and my parents. And I guess that diagnosis got me thinking about big picture stuff too, like the future and security and being able to continue living life here and now in a way that makes us happy. And so that tiny house, eh? For someone with commitment issues to just one spot in the world, a mobile home is perfect. And even a tiny house would no doubt feel pretty luxurious to us. But our big question was, how do we live in a tiny house in Scotland? Firstly, what tiny house? And secondly, where could we put it? Naturally, I took to the internet to try and answer these questions, where my initial euphoria at finding tiny house build companies in the UK, paired with cheap plots of land for sale in Scotland, quickly fizzled out, as I realised that it is just not that simple. So, as a starting point for answering those big questions, we went to the pub, where all good ideas flow, and wrote down what a tiny house would mean to us. First and foremost, we wanted a place where we feel good and inspired. We wanted that place to be a base of our own when we're in Scotland, give us access to the outdoors, and be a good launchpad for continued travels. And we wanted security for the future, knowing that we'd always have somewhere to come back to, somewhere to live. A base is how we've always thought of our tiny house, not as somewhere to settle down and make a full-time commitment to. After years spent creating a way of life that allows us flexibility and freedom, I was scared of losing that, of feeling tied down and financially and physically burdened by something. As a way of hopefully counteracting this, we decided that our tiny house should be our home when we want it to be, but it could also be a place that we share with others, renting it out whenever we want to travel, and thus contributing to our income rather than draining it. Starting our search for a tiny house, we quickly realised that the few off-the-shelf models that we could find in the UK just didn't cut it, in style or layout. Years of watching Living Big in a Tiny House had left me with a pretty non-negotiable vision for what our own tiny house might look like, and one that really didn't function well for our needs or put a smile on my face every single day. Just wasn't worth throwing everything that we had at it. Also, the companies I found didn't really fill me with confidence, being very young startups with too vague info about, well, everything. Investing our future in them felt far too risky, and sure enough, 2 years later, some of those companies don't seem to exist anymore. We'd have to keep searching, to Google page 10 and beyond, to find our answer to what tiny house. As for where to put it, the options seemed both clear-cut and very murky at the same time. The most common answer is within the curtilage of your home, also known as your back garden or that of a friend or family member, using the tiny house as an ancillary building, meaning that you technically still rely on the main house for certain services like the bathroom or cooking facilities. But such a parking spot wasn't an option for us. Locating a tiny house on a rented pitch at a residential caravan or park home site is another possibility. But while we could think of a few beautifully situated caravan sites we'd come across on our travels in Scotland, this really wasn't the kind of base that we were looking for. And this option comes with its own complications, such as time limits on full-time occupancy, and even age limits at some parks, and it turns out that we are just too young. Approaching a farmland owner, of which we know none, and asking to rent a parking spot is another suggested option. But for this to be legal, the house needs to fall within permitted development laws, and most likely be classified as temporary accommodation for agricultural workers. None of the above could really be considered long-term solutions for where to put a tiny house, or realistic options for a tiny house that we wanted to function as our permanent residence, as well as a short-term rental sometime in the future. So what about one of those cheap plots of land for sale? Well, it turns out that even if you own your own land, you can't just stick a tiny house on it and live there legally for more than 28 days a year. You have to obtain planning permission for it. Or you could legally live in a tiny house on your land if you have planning permission for building another dwelling that you've started work on, with your tiny house being a temporary living situation until the main dwelling is finished, which could be in 1 year or in 10 years. Who's to say how quickly your build progress comes along? Wading through all of these options, it seemed that the best of a rather confusing bunch was to buy our own wee plot of land and secure planning permission for whatever tiny house we wanted to put there. This would keep everything legal and above board, giving us a sense of security for the future. Also, we knew that new short-term rental licensing laws were coming into effect in Scotland as of October 2023. And if we wanted to obtain a licence to rent out our home in the future, that legal and above board stuff would be pretty important. With this decision made, it felt like we'd taken the first step towards our tiny house dream. But there was still a lot to figure out on our journey to turning this idea into reality. We've been documenting the process over the last couple of years, and now we want to share our experience with you. The highs and lows, the things that have gone to plan and the mistakes that have been made. The learning curves, surprises, disappointments, and excitement along the way on our path to swapping nomadic life for tiny house living in the far north of Scotland. We hope you'll join us. The hogs in the paddock.